Welcome to episode 14 of Fixing America with J Mel. This episode is entitled, Has the American Definition of Freedom Changed? In the last episode on popular sovereignty, Part 3, we discussed the ways Trump has abused the rule of law and exceeded constitutional limits through ICE and his 2025 presidential transition plan. In this episode, we will continue to explore how citizens of a liberal democracy can know if their sovereignty is secure and they are in control by the nature and extent of their freedom of expression and information. I remember a ballad that suggested that freedom is just another way of saying that you have nothing left to lose. And whichever way you choose to say it, it doesn't have any meaning if you're not free. To me, that lyric defines freedom as having everything to gain. If you're down to nothing left to lose, you can only go up, and that means the world is your oyster. Others say it captures the adventurous spirit of the 1960s counterculture and the unrestricted life where the journey itself was more meaningful than the destination. Whatever meaning you ascribe to those lyrics, one thing is undeniable. The subject is freedom. Those lyrics may also mean that the social construct of freedom can change with time. Just as the carefree attitude of the rebellious 60s has faded, I pose the question, has our society's definition of freedom changed? And does that play a significant role in any segment of our society acquiescing to authoritarianism and not fighting Trump's increasingly bold destruction of our liberal democracy? I suspect it has. That suspicion has haunted me for years, and I could not understand or explain why. And then one day I realized that certain comments by my right-wing friends triggered a sense that my friend and I were living in different philosophical spheres. Comments like, climate change is a natural thing. I don't trust them technocrats. We need to get back to the old-fashioned home remedies. According to science, everything will kill you. And the statement, put God back in government and schools. I realized that my friend's world was anti-science, and that his philosophical emphasis was on tradition, heritage, faith, national identity, conservative values, obedience, and hierarchy. Shortly thereafter, I discovered the teachings of Christian nationalism, promoting violence to make America follow its theology and invoke the Newt Gingrich abhorrence to compromise and scorched earth political philosophy. But it wasn't until I explored the philosophical foundation of individual freedom embodied in our Constitution that I discovered that the freedom construct can change. I explored the philosophy of freedom and its history and discovered that the freedom construct of society can change. It provides lessons that help us understand why our country lives in two vastly different universes today, and it may aid our effort at fixing America. This episode will explore that topic. Yes, philosophy is a deep subject, but don't worry, my small brain is not esoterically equipped to explain it in intellectual terms. My hypothesis is presented from a historical standpoint that even I can comprehend. Let's start by reviewing what the right of freedom means in a liberal democracy. Simply put, it is freedom of speech and expression, freedom of religion and conscience, freedom of assembly and association, freedom of press, freedom of movement, right to privacy, right to due process, and fair trial. Those freedoms are guaranteed by our Constitution. The framers of our Constitution, especially Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, were deeply influenced by John Locke's, who lived in 1632 to 1704, political philosophy that freedom embodies a person's natural right to life, liberty, and property, governance with limited power by consent of the people, the right to revolution if the government violates their natural rights, and the foundational structure that no one, not even the president, is above the law. Our constitutional concept of freedom also embodies Immanuel Kant's philosophy. He lived from 1724 to 1804. That grounds freedom in moral responsibility and universal human dignity, where liberty is inseparable from respect for others' rational agency. Our constitutional concept of freedom also borrowed from the work of John Stuart Mill. He lived from 1806 to 1873. He championed open expression and self-realization. As to the former, he postulated that open expression is essential to maximize happiness. As to the latter, he preached that liberty is not an end in itself, but a means to achieve the greatest possible happiness through the development of individuality. Our Constitution's subsequent interpretations recognize Isaiah Berlin's, who lived from 1909 to 1997, two-dimensional aspect of freedom. Negative freedom, that is, freedom from external interference, like the right to express your opinions freely or to practice your religion without government interference, and positive freedom, that is, the freedom to do something or have the capacity for self-mastery and self-realization. The foregoing scholars, except Berlin, influenced the framers of our Constitution to view freedom as applying equally to all, regardless of status, belief, or background. Their philosophical work convinced our framers that the government itself should be bound by law, ensuring that freedom cannot be taken arbitrarily, and it helped form their beliefs that political power must rest on the consent of the governed, expressed through free and fair elections. Next, we will briefly review how the Trump administration has adversely affected the liberal democratic right of freedom. Many of these have been discussed or at least identified in prior episodes, which are recommended for your review. I will not attempt to restate those in this episode. To include a comprehensive list is far beyond the practical limits of one episode. I will touch upon a few that are representative of what has and is happening that should be alarming to every citizen of this great country. In the March 5th, 2025 issue of Time magazine, Scott Nover noted that in Trump's March 4, 2025 address to a joint session of Congress, he bragged about restoring free speech, stating that, and I quote, "I've stopped all government censorship and brought back free speech in America," end quote. Mr. Nover forcefully and persuasively disputes that claim by noting that Trump consistently rewards speeches he likes while punishing speech he does not like. He notes that Trump's viewpoint discrimination is exactly what the First Amendment seeks to prevent. He also notes that Trump kicked AP reporters out of presidential briefings in the Oval Room and aboard Air Force One because its reporters dared to criticize the president's executive order to rename the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. AP sued, and Trump was ordered to reverse its stance. In response, Trump changed how the press pool is selected, a change that gives the president more control over which press agencies are granted access. That shows that Trump is deliberately trying, despite the court's ruling to suppress the press's access to his briefing some media outlets, but open to his sycophant reporters. Trump has also systematically rolled back civil rights protections within the Department of Justice and the Inspector General Corps, as previously discussed in an earlier episode. He has disabled or undermined oversight bodies such as the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, and we have previously discussed his attacks on DEI, which protects certain individuals from discrimination consistent with the liberal democratic concept of freedom. He has removed oversight functions from independent agencies by removing key leaders, and for partisan reasons has withheld federal funds to force federal agencies, private companies, and institutions to comply with his directives aimed at restricting institutional and individual freedoms and rights. He has sought to restrict birthright citizenship and used immigration status to suppress dissent and limit rights. Next, we will discuss what history has taught us about attacks on the liberal democratic right of freedom. First, freedom is most fragile in times of fear or crisis. In those trying times, leaders are often tempted to trade liberty for security or unity. The Alien and Sedition Act of 1798 criminalized dissent and opposition to government by jailing journalists and political opponents. During the Civil War era, President Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, detaining thousands without trial. While arguably justified in wartime, it left a permanent scar on our nation's promise of liberty. The internment of Japanese Americans during World War II also blemished the trustworthiness of our government to guarantee our individual rights. And the post-9/11 era USA Patriot Act weakened citizen trust in our nation's most coveted promise. In the McCarthy era, post-Watergate times, and modern efforts to discredit the press, civil service, and judiciary, we have seen our freedom erode slowly through normalization of our guaranteed liberties. History also teaches us that checks and balances are the guardians of freedom. Marbury versus Madison, decided in 1803, established judicial review, something Trump is attempting to dismantle today. Congressional oversight, independent inspectors general, and professional civil service have historically exposed abuses. Watergate, Iran-Contra, and Trump's latest attacks have weakened or eliminated those checks and balances. The Pentagon Papers, that's the 1971 deal, revealed how investigative journalism can hold government accountable. Trump is actively trying to destroy that journalistic check on power. If successful, that would restrict our freedom. Equality and freedom rise and fall together. Abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, and the civil rights movement broadened who are counted as free. Conversely, Jim Crow laws, Native American displacement, and immigration exclusion acts, and Trump's recent attacks on minority groups, immigrants, liberals, and Democrats have replaced inclusion, which expands freedom, with exclusion, which restricts freedom. And last, history teaches us that freedom requires civic vigilance, not passive faith. We must, especially today, be aware that leaders have sometimes invoked freedom to justify surveillance, censorship, or discrimination. The lesson we should remember is to look not at the words, but at the effect on individual autonomy, equality, and accountability. And now let's focus on how and why a society's philosophy of individual freedom can change the construct of freedom of a society or segment of society. History proves that the scientific revolution, 1540 to 1700, profoundly transformed not only science and technology, but also philosophy, politics, and ideas about human freedom. It is marked in history by Nicolaus Copernicus's 1473 to 1543 creation of the heliocentric model to prove the Earth revolves around the Sun. Johannes Kepler's 1572 to 1630 development of mathematical laws governing planetary movement. Galileo Galilei 1564 to 1642 empirical observations challenging the church authority. Francis Bacon's 1561 to 1626 establishment of the scientific method and inductive reasoning, and René Descartes' 1596 to 1650 introduction of rationalism, cognito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, and Isaac Newton's 1642 to 1727 unveiling of his universal laws of motion and gravitation. Before the scientific revolution, the meaning of freedom was vastly different from the modern liberal democratic understanding that emphasizes individual rights and autonomy. In ancient Greece, freedom meant the right to civic participation and self-rule, not personal independence. Ancient Greek and Roman philosophers, called Stoics, believed that living a virtuous life was the key to happiness. In Rome, Marcus Tullius Cicero, 106 BC to 43 BC, influence meant living under laws that applied equally to all. In the Middle Ages, 479 AD to 1450 AD, Christian philosophy prevailed, and freedom was primarily spiritual. The freedom to choose good over evil and to follow God's will. In that time, society was feudal and hierarchical. Freedom, in a legal sense, meant being free from feudal obligations and political and economic freedom. That was the status, not a universal right. During the early Renaissance, 1401 to 1490s, freedom remained largely collective and moral rather than individual and inalienable. In summary, before the scientific revolution, the source of truth was the church, tradition, and authority, with the idea that human beings were subject to divine hierarchy. Nature was reviewed as mystical and teleological, that is, meaning explaining phenomena in terms of the purpose they serve rather than of the cause by which they arise. The prevailing view of freedom was obedience and conformity, and their philosophical legacy was medieval scholasticism, which describes a method of learning in medieval Europe that emphasized dialectic reasoning to reconcile faith with reason, primarily by integrating classical philosophy, especially from Aristotle, with Christian theology. In case you aren't familiar with the term dialectic, as I wasn't, it means the art of investigating or discussing the truth of opinions. In contrast, after the scientific revolution, people used observation, reason, and individual inquiry to seek the source of truth. They viewed human beings as rational, autonomous, and capable of discovery. Nature was viewed as law-governed and understandable through science. Freedom was viewed as self-determination through reason, and the philosophical legacy changed from medieval scholasticism to Enlightenment, liberalism, and human rights. The scientific revolution transformed the world's understanding of truth and authority. It is possible that when a society rejects science and replaces reason, evidence, and individual inquiry with tradition, authority, mysticism, and a form of medieval scholasticism, that it creates an alternate universe. If so, that explains why our country is so divided. Does that explain why compromise is impossible? Can a group in an enlightened era regress back to a dark, unenlightened era? And even more important, can society that has regressed be revised back to enlightenment? And if so, how is that done? Those questions will be exciting topics for future episodes. I hope you will join me again for my next episode. Thank you for listening. Remember to hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe. Be safe and increase your ohms of resistance.